July 1841, New York City. A 21-year-old woman tells her fiancé she's visiting her aunt. She never arrives. 3 days later, her body is pulled from the river, beaten, strangled with lace from her own clothing. The case explodes across every newspaper. Theories multiply. Suspects are questioned. But the truth? It was a hot and humid day in New York City, 93 degrees in the shade. Sunday, July 25th, 1841. Mary Cecilia Rogers was preparing to go out. She put on a white dress, a black shawl, and a blue scarf, light-colored shoes, a leghorn hat. She grabbed a parasol to protect herself from the rays of the midsummer sun. Mary lived at the boarding house she ran with her mother, Phoebe, at 126 Nassau Street in the heart of the city. Phoebe, a widow, had begun renting rooms in 1840 to men who were looking for work in New York City. The boarders included Daniel Payne, William Keokuk, Alfred Crommelin, and Archibald Padley. Once she was ready to leave for the day, Mary knocked on Daniel Payne's bedroom door. The cork cutter had come to board in the fall of 1840. He became involved with Mary soon afterward, and the couple was engaged. Payne was in the midst of shaving when Mary told him that she was off to visit her aunt, Mrs. Downing, and would return in the evening. As Payne said goodbye, he told his fiancée that he would wait for her at the stagecoach stop on the corner of Broadway and Ann Streets at 7 p.m., as he often did when she came home late. The three-story red brick boarding house on Nassau Street was at the center of the city's newspaper, printing, and publishing industries. It was located close to City Hall, the port area, and Wall Street. It was quiet, as it usually was on Sundays, when Mary stepped outside at 10 in the morning. Shops and taverns were closed until late afternoon, and the streets were empty except for a few churchgoers and those out for an early walk. About an hour later, Payne went to visit his brother, John Payne, and then he headed downtown to join the crowds that gathered on Broadway in the early evening. A storm blew in as he was walking towards Ann Street to meet Mary at 7 p.m. Believing that she would most likely wait out the thunderstorm at her aunt's house for the night, Payne returned to the boarding house alone and went to sleep. It didn't seem unusual to anyone at the boarding house when Mary did not return home first thing the next morning, but by lunchtime that Monday, her continuing absence began to worry her mother and Payne. He went to see Mrs. Downing and discovered that Mary had never arrived at her aunt's house. He continued to search for his fiancée, but neither friends nor relatives had seen her. He searched from Harlem to Brooklyn, Hoboken to Staten Island, but he found no sign of her. Payne walked into the offices of the New York Sun and placed a missing person notice to run in Tuesday's edition of the paper. It was not the first time that 21-year-old Mary Rogers had disappeared. John Anderson hired the pretty young woman in 1838 to stand behind the counter at his tobacco shop on nearby Broadway, hoping her presence at Anderson's Tobacco Emporium would attract male customers. Gold lettering above the door listed the items for sale inside, including cigars, fine-cut, and confections. Mary became known as the beautiful cigar girl, and the shop became a popular hangout for authors, editors, and newspaper reporters. One day in October 1838, Mary failed to show up for work. She reappeared 2 weeks later, saying that she had been resting with friends in Brooklyn because she felt tired. She was surprised by the amount of interest that her disappearance had generated. A rumor began circulating that Mary had been seen in the company of a tall and handsome naval officer during her absence. She never returned to work for Anderson. 2 days after Mary disappeared on July 25th, 1841, Payne continued to search for his fiancée. He heard that a young woman matching Mary's description had been seen at a pub for several hours on the day that she disappeared. He spoke to the keeper of the pub, but was no closer to finding her. After finding no trace of her during a second trip to Hoboken, he returned to the city in early afternoon. Payne went to the shop where he worked as a cork cutter and went home at 7 p.m. The next morning, Crommelin joined the search. He had lived at the Rogers boarding house from December 7, 1840, until June 1841. He moved out after Mary rejected him in favor of his fellow boarder Payne. Just before she disappeared, Mary left a rose in the keyhole of Crommelin's office door. Although he found out on Monday that Mary hadn't returned home, he didn't start looking for her until he saw the newspaper advertisement about her disappearance on Wednesday. He spoke to Phoebe to confirm her daughter's disappearance. Crommelin then joined the search with his friend Padley, who had also once roomed at the Rogers boarding house. They took one of the steamboats that frequently crossed the Hudson River from New York City to Hoboken. After disembarking near a hotel and tavern, it was a short walk to the Elysian Fields, a scenic spot of about 4 or 5 acres that was surrounded on 3 sides by trees and looked towards the river on the 4th side. In the 1840s, it was a popular spot for city dwellers to get away to the country. It was also home to a popular refreshment house known as Nick Moore's House. In that sweltering afternoon of July 28, 1841, James Ballar and Henry Mallon were walking along the shore near a part of Hoboken known as Sybil's Cave. As they looked out across the Hudson River, one of the men spotted a body floating in the water about 200 or 300 yards from where they were standing. Ballar and Mallon raced to the Elysian Fields dock, jumped into a boat, and rowed quickly towards it. As they got closer, they realized it was the fully dressed body of a young woman. They tried several times unsuccessfully to fish the body out of the river, and finally they tied a rope around the dead woman and dragged her back to shore behind the boat. At the same time, John Bertram, William Waller, and a man named Luther spotted what they initially thought were clothes as they cruised by in their sailboat. By the time Ballar and Mallon had reached the shore with their cargo, a crowd had gathered. The men laid the woman's body down on the beach. As people pressed forward to gawk, Crommelin, who had joined the growing crowd, leaned forward and realized he was staring at the body of Mary Rogers. She was still wearing the same clothes that she had put on 3 days earlier: a flowered bonnet, blue dress, petticoat, panelettes, stockings, and garters. But her face was badly beaten. She had strips of lace from her petticoat tied around her neck in a sailor's knot, and her body was bruised and waterlogged. Mary's body was transported from the beach to the village of Hoboken, where County Coroner Dr. Richard F. Cook performed an autopsy. He concluded that the beautiful Cigar girl had been beaten, gagged, strangled, and raped, perhaps repeatedly, before being thrown into the Hudson River. He also said that her face was swollen and that there was a mark about the size and shape of a man's thumb on the right side of her neck and 2 or 3 marks on the left side that resembled the shape of a man's fingers. Marks appeared to indicate that her wrists had been tied together and her dress was torn. Blood was still seeping from her mouth. There were no signs that Mary was pregnant. Crommelin identified the body and stayed with it until the coroner had completed his investigation. By then it was nearly 9 p.m., and the ferries had stopped operating for the day. Crommelin stayed at the Jersey City Hotel and returned to New York City in the morning, bringing news of Mary's death and some pieces of her clothing, including flowers from her hat, a garter, the bottom of her pantalette, and a curl of her hair. Phoebe Rogers confirmed they belonged to her daughter. A grieving Phoebe closed up her boarding house and moved in with her sister. It was so hot that Mary's body was quickly buried in Hoboken, New Jersey, within hours of being found to prevent it from decomposing further. But her story did not die after her burial. Instead, it grew once New York City newspapers began covering the murder on August 1st, 1841, 4 days after her body was found and a week after she had vanished. It was more than the lurid details of her death that captivated reporters and editors. Mary, who was known as the beautiful Cigar girl, had waited on many of them when she worked at Anderson's Tobacco Emporium. Newly emerging tabloid newspapers, known as the penny press, went into a frenzy with their coverage of the unsolved murder. More respectable newspapers followed. Author Amy Srebnick noted in her book that the New York Herald said that a young and beautiful girl has been seduced and murdered within hail of this populous place. The New York Tribune noted that the horrible murder of Miss Rogers excites daily a deeper and wider interest in our city. The case changed the way in which the press covered homicides, and they began reporting virtually every clue and possible suspect in the case, which helped to sell newspapers. For example, the Herald published the lengthy details of the coroner's report on August 17, 1841. Newspapers also floated theories about the circumstances surrounding Mary's death. They speculated that she had been brutally raped and killed by one of the urban gangs that roamed the streets of New York City, that she had been killed by one of her beaux, that her death was a suicide, and even that she had not died but merely disappeared, and that the body that was found belonged to some other unfortunate young woman. The coverage sparked competition among the media outlets and generated public interest in the story. Members of the public went to Sybil's cave to see where Mary's body had been found. The newspapers also called for more involvement by police and other government officials in what they felt was a dragging official investigation. Herald editor James Gordon Bennett set up a citizens committee to complain about what his group felt was a slow response to the murder by the police and government officials, and to offer a reward for information leading to arrests in the case. New York Governor William Seward subsequently added to the reward money. Meanwhile, police argued over the jurisdiction of the investigation, which centered on where each side believed she had been murdered. New Jersey authorities said that New York City police should investigate because they claimed Mary had been killed in New York and her body was dumped into the Hudson River before drifting into the New Jersey area. However, New York City police said that New Jersey should lead the investigation because Mary had been murdered off Hoboken, discovered near the community, and buried there. The investigation dragged and advanced little while the two sides wrangled. Newspapers pointed out that regardless of where Mary Rogers had been killed, she was a New York resident. City officials finally bowed to public pressure and took on the case. At the request of New York City's acting mayor, Mary's body was exhumed from her grave in Hoboken on Wednesday, August 11, 1841, and brought to the dead house at City Hall Park in New York City. Although the New Jersey coroner had determined that the cause of death was strangulation, the New York City coroner registered the cause of death as a drowning. Mary was finally buried without ceremony at the cemetery of the West Presbyterian Church. The New York City police investigation into the murder finally went into full swing. They received information that Mary was seen in the company of an unidentified man in the hours before her disappearance. In an effort to find him, police questioned several men, including Payne, former boarders Crommelin and Keokuk, as well as Joseph Morse and her former employer, John Anderson. Newspapers almost immediately cast suspicion on Mary's fiancé, Daniel Payne. He quickly went to the offices of the New York Times and Evening Star to show sworn affidavits from witnesses attesting to his whereabouts on the day Mary disappeared. Police noted that the lace around the victim's neck had been tied in a seaman's knot, and suspicion fell on sailor and former boarder William Keokuk. At the time, the law allowed police to hold suspects for days without being charged. Arresting people first and then finding evidence against them afterwards was not unusual. Police arrested Keokuk on suspicion of being involved in Mary's death, but witnesses provided a credible alibi for his whereabouts between the Sunday that Mary disappeared and the Tuesday when he boarded the USS North Carolina in the harbor. Then police turned their attention to wood engraver Joseph Morse, who worked on Nassau Street and had apparently been seen with Mary Rogers the same evening that she disappeared. The morning after she vanished, Morse had a violent fight with his wife and fled town. Police tracked him down and found him living under an assumed name in Boylston, Massachusetts. They arrested him and brought him back to New York by steamboat for questioning. He said that he had indeed spent the night with a woman named Mary. He was released a few days later, after a woman named Mary Haviland came forward and said that she was the woman he had been with on Staten Island the day that Mary Rogers disappeared. In fact, he tried unsuccessfully to seduce her in a hotel room, she recounted. John Anderson, Mary's former employer, was also questioned. However, his statements to police were not splashed across the pages of New York newspapers, unlike those of other men whom police questioned. Perhaps this was intended to protect him because of his position and influence. Having run out of leads, the police investigation stalled momentarily. At the end of August, two boys found a small opening in a thicket that led into a cramped cave not far from where Mary's body was found. On 4 stones were draped a silk scarf, white petticoat, parasol, and a mildewed linen handkerchief with the initials M.R. The boys picked up the items and brought them to their mother, Frederica Loss, who was the innkeeper of Nick Moore's house near the Elysian Fields. She turned over the clothing to police. Then a stagecoach driver came forward and said that he thought he had seen Mary arrive on the Hoboken ferry with a well-dressed man who had a dark complexion. He said they had gone to a tavern kept by Mrs. Loss. When questioned by police, Loss said she remembered them coming in for a drink and then leaving and wandering off into the woods. She said she later heard a scream but didn't pay attention to it because Sundays often bring people with rowdy behavior. The discovery of the clothes increased interest in the case for a few weeks. On October 8, 1841, Daniel Payne left New York City and wandered around the Hoboken area in a drunken state. 2 New Yorkers were out walking when they found him lying on the ground near the thicket where his fiancée's clothes had been found. He was drunk and had an empty bottle of laudanum beside him. He lost consciousness quickly and died. A note in his pocket read, "To the world, here I am on the spot. God forgive me for my misfortune and my misspent time." He had committed suicide. His friends and his brother John said that he had been devastated by Mary's death and drank heavily. Interest in the case waned again until the fall of 1842. Innkeeper Frederica Loss was accidentally shot by one of her 3 sons while he was handling a loaded gun. As she lay dying, she called Justice Gilbert Merritt of New Jersey to her bedside. He had questioned her previously because he believed that she provided abortions or allowed her in to be used by doctors for that purpose. He suspected that Mary had died there during a botched abortion and that Loss's sons had disposed of the body. Loss told Merritt that Mary came to her house on Sunday, July 25, 1841, with a young doctor who performed an abortion. Mary died of complications while under the physician's care, and Loss's sons dropped the body into the river at night where it would be found. Her clothes were scattered in the woods, where they were later located. The confession was questioned because it failed to explain the thumb and finger marks that the coroner had found around Mary's neck. Loss's sons were questioned, but they refused to corroborate their mother's confession, and the case was dropped. Was Mary murdered, or did she die following an abortion? The case has never been solved. But it marked the rise of tabloids, which used the death of Mary Rogers to sell newspapers to a growing readership of working-class men and women. Papers such as the New York Herald, the Evening Post, and the Tribune competed with one another as they followed every lead in the case and published coroner's reports and depositions. The city's growing printing and publishing industry used it to give rise to commercial novels, serialized detective stories, and graphic portrayals of Mary Rogers. American poet and short story writer Edgar Allan Poe subsequently wrote The Mystery of Marie Roget, a fictionalized account based on the murder of Mary Rogers. His story appeared in 3 parts in Snowden's Lady's Companion in November and December 1842 and in February 1843. In the story, his fictional detective character named C. Auguste Dupin tries to solve the crime. Poe relied heavily on media coverage from the rising penny press as the source of his information about the Rogers murder. The death of the beautiful Cigar girl marked an early example of how the media seized on a gruesome crime to boost its circulation. The truth about what happened to Mary Rogers that summer day in 1841 may be lost to history, but perhaps you've seen something we missed. Who do you think was responsible for her death? Was it one of the men we discussed, or does the answer lie somewhere else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries, subscribe to Unsolved Case. There are more stories waiting to be told. Until next time.